Congressional continues.
Congressman Ron Paul, Republican of Texas, former presidential candidate this past cycle. Welcome and thank you for being here this morning.
Nice to be with you.
You're facing retirement, so this is just the last few weeks of your term representing the people of Texas. The fiscal cliff, the so-called fiscal cliff, is the big issue on the agenda here in the waning weeks of Congress. What do you think can happen? What do you want to see happen?
Well, there's lots I wanted to happen, and I've been working on it for 30 years and nothing has happened. So I only have 2 weeks left to solve all these problems. I don't think much is going to happen. I mean, the real solutions aren't even discussed. What they do in January, they'll paper it over to give some type of an agreement that they'll solve the problems later, and they'll appease a few people, and I don't think a major calamity is going to happen, in January. They'll do something, but it'll be very temporary, and it might give reassurance for a week. It's sort of like what we hear when we hear the news about the problems in Greece. I don't know how many solutions they've had. They've probably had 15 solutions in the last 2 years, and every time they come up with a solution, the markets seem to respond favorably. But the whole problem, whether it's Greece or the United States, is we're broke. And most countries of the world aren't solvent, except maybe in the Far East now, in China and some other places. They have money in the bank. But they're not facing up to the fact and admitting that we're broke. If you're broke, if you or I are broke, we have to cut spending back or work harder or declare bankruptcy or something. But a country doesn't do that as long as the credit is good. And because of our past performance, because there still is wealth in this country, because we have a strong military, it is perceived that we'll, work our way out of it. So our credit remains good. So that really discourages politicians from feeling the pressure to do something because they're not talking about any cuts. Neither side wants a significant real cut of anything, and so it's impossible. So I think we're at that point where we've passed the opportunity to actually work our way out of this. So I think the inevitable will be delayed, and it's going to take a while for people to realize that we have to change what we're doing in our government, change the role of our government, and that's I think what the people have to realize.
If you'd like to talk with Congressman Ron Paul, Republican of Texas, here are the numbers to dial. Democrats, it's 202-585-3880. Republicans, 202-585-3881. And independent callers, 202-585-3882. Let's take a look at one of the issues at stake in this so-called fiscal cliff, the tax increases that could happen if Congress doesn't take action. And we've got a graphic here on the screen to show our viewers. If you make in the $20,000 range or lower, your average tax increase would be about $400. If you make between $20,000 and $40,000, you're looking at a $1,200 tax increase, and it goes up from there. The $40,000 to $64,000 range, it's almost $2,000 in your taxes going up. And then if you make between $64,000, $108,000, you could see a boost in your taxes of $3,500. And then if you make even more than that, looking at $15,000 tax increase for the higher wage earners in the $108,000 income bracket and beyond. Congressman Paul, do you think Congress do you think this will happen? I mean, you've just talked about sort of what the 113th Congress may do in the coming year, but what about some of the short-term stuff?
Well, I think there'll be every effort to not raise those taxes on the low-income and middle-income individuals, but it just represents the fact that they don't have a solution because they gave these temporary cuts, on the withholding tax and all, and they're kidding themselves. So I think they'll probably change that a little bit, but they still will face a major problem. And this is the reason I think the markets are so weak here since the election, that not only are they facing this crisis, but the taxes are going to go up. I mean, the president's pretty blunt about this, but he says, we're only going to raise it on the rich. Well, the rich are the ones that, sometimes start a business and other things. So you point out correctly that some of these taxes are going to go up unless they change things on the middle class and the poor. Going to be devastating to the economy, and it's there's no easy solution because nobody wants to consider that we have to cut spending, we have to change our foreign policy, and we have to reassess the whole entitlement system, and they're not in the mood to do that, because politically there's too many people who would say, hey, you can't touch my program, touch somebody else's. So that is the reason we're going to continue to do this. Things are going to get a lot worse until the crisis gets so bad that we have a currency crisis and interest rates go up, and then we'll have to revamp. But that's not going to happen in January. It's all they're going to pass the buck.
Let's go to the phones, hear what the viewers have to say to you. Fort Myers, Florida, Barb is on our Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. What I think is that all of the Bush tax cuts should be eliminated, and those dollars be applied to the deficit, and that for the areas under sequestration, I think that they should eliminate the requirement that everything be cut across the board, and let the Defense Department determine what they need and what they don't need, and the same in the discretionary areas.
I agree with half of what you say. I think the military is a big problem that both sides really don't want to touch, because they believe that we should be involved in all the countries of the world. We should be involved in all these wars. And I say, no, bring the troops home, stop fighting the wars. Our national debt in these last 10 years, through the Bush and the Obama administration, our national debt went up over $4 trillion just because of these wars that are senseless, totally senseless, loss of life. And now they're talking about, when are we going to go in? We're so much involved. We're involved in Libya, and look at what's going on in Libya. Iraq is still a mess. They want to go to war against Iran. They're trying to get us involved in Syria. So I would say that's the place to have big cuts. We all ought to agree on doing that. But I wouldn't raise taxes. I mean, that isn't the problem. We need to cut the spending. If you raise taxes, you're going to have a weaker economy. And some of those tax cuts, even for the middle class, occurred with the Bush administration. So you don't want to you don't want to raise taxes on the middle class, but saying, oh, just do it on the rich. Won't be enough money. It won't be enough money to touch this. But I think you've touched on something. I think we need to deal with the military, but we can't do that unless we change our foreign policy and not assume the role as a world policeman and getting involved in all these countries. I would think the American people ought to agree on that issue more readily than anything else. I don't see why we should talk about cutting health care for children or for the elderly and Social Security. I don't think that's where you have to start. I think we have to start by changing our foreign policy.
As Republicans come to the negotiating table in the next couple of weeks, what do you think they're willing to agree on? What will your party, move on?
Oh, my guess is that they're going to agree on some tax increases, and they'll call them tax reform, and they'll probably agree to some of these so-called spending cuts. But even the spending cuts that are with sequestration, they're not cuts. They're token little cuts on proposed increases, the automatic increases with baseline budgeting. So this is what is so deceptive, is cuts aren't cuts. Cuts are just backing off a little bit on automatic increases. So they're going to agree probably to raise some taxes and pretend they're cutting by taxing and by not increasing the spending quite as rapidly, and it won't solve the problem. That's what I think will happen.
Natalie, next caller in Virginia Beach, Republican. Go ahead, Natalie.
Hi, I just want to first say thank you for your service, and I look forward to hearing about what you do after your career. I, myself, and my husband both are serving in the military, and both of us can't help but be a little disturbed about what's going on right now with the whole thing with Benghazi and with all the things that are going on with General Petraeus and General Allen and General Ham. And I just wanted to ask you, being someone that has served for as long as you have, I don't want to say that there's a cover-up happening or whatnot, but I just can't help but think that there's some type of correlation between all these high-wigged generals or armed forces, the fact that that something's happening with them, and this whole situation with Benghazi. I just wanted to know, from your standpoint, what you feel about the correlation between the two.
Well, I think there's a lot of things you have to sort out there. First, it's the wars that are going on and what are the responsibility of the CIA. Then you have the sex scandal, and then you have the cover-up. So I think the sex scandal and the cover-up is natural. That's what politicians do. They always have investigations, but that's sort of a blame game. But I think they're missing the whole thing. They're talking about the sex and they're talking about the cover-up. But I'm more interested in talking about, our responsibility. So we have a General Petraeus who's been running a military and running these wars, which I think are a total disaster. And all he gets is high praise for his military skills. So he gets put over in the CIA, and he doesn't even realize about, the ability to look at emails. And he's supposed to protect us. And look at the protection the CIA gave the people Benghazi, and this is a reflection of the foreign policy. Why do we support these rebels? We put them in charge, then they turn on us. That's exactly what's happening in Afghanistan now. We're training these Afghanis to be able to take care of themselves. So after they get trained on how to shoot these guns, they turn around and they shoot the trainees. The trainers. So that policy makes no sense whatsoever. So how this all pans out, it remains to be seen. But I think that it's that we have to deal with the policy itself. Not only would that save the money, but other countries realize there was a big problem in Libya. See, we should have never been involved in Libya. Congress didn't vote on that. The president went into, supported the rebels by the authority coming from NATO. And that's where our basic problem is. And then we get the bad guys in, and then they turn on us. One thing they should ask is, what is the reason they do this? What is the motive? Anything from 9/11 on, any murder that has ever occurred, any killing that occurs, the police said, we got to find something. They have to have a motive. So when people get killed like they were at Benghazi, what is the motive? What is going on? That's the kind of thing that we should be looking at. Unfortunately, right now we have a real mess and a scandal. But I think it should be expected, mainly because when we get involved in the internal affairs of other nations, get involved in wars we shouldn't be involved, doing it without the proper permission of the Congress, believe me, we're going to have chaos, and it's going to continue until we change our attitude. And quite frankly, if we followed the Constitution, we wouldn't be involved in so many of these countries.
Alex writes in on our Facebook page, which our viewers can find by looking for C-SPAN, and has this question for you, Congressman Paul. What do you suggest people in other countries who support and follow your message should do to advance the cause of liberty?
Well, they have a personal responsibility. They need to understand it and how personal responsibility solves a lot of the problems. Government reflects the people, and if the people assume responsibility for themselves, it would be less for the government to do. But what we need to do is to restrain the government, and that's what the Constitution does. The Constitution has no restraints on the people. The restraints are placed on the government, but we don't follow that. So I think it's not trying to get people to realize that self-reliance is better than depending on a government that only can transfer wealth from one group to another and undermine the system. Yes, for a while they can get away with it, but eventually they destroy the currency, they destroy the production in a free market economy, and they have to argue for free market economics. They have to argue for property rights. They have to argue for sound money. They have to argue the case against central banking, and they have to argue the case that self-determination is important, and that means that the smaller the units of government, the better. So we were all very pleased with seeing the breaking up of the Soviet Union and getting smaller units. That was very, very healthy, but they have to follow through wherever they are and to have a market economy, and the more freedom a country has, the more prosperous it will be. Governments can't create prosperity, and I think it's that format of the type of government we should have would solve so many of our problems.
Antioch, California. Eric is on our Independence line, joining Congressman Ron Paul. Go ahead, Eric.
Hi. I'd just like to say first that Congressman, to the Libertarian movement, just to America in general, I consider you a hero. Also, I'd like your opinion as to what's going on right now with Israel and Palestine, to Gaza. I think Israel might be acting upon Hamas in order to clear their flank for possible actions against Iran. And thereby maybe pulling us in. I was wondering what your opinions would be on those issues.
Yeah, well, that is a mess, and it's been a mess for a long time, and I believe we should be non-interventionists. We shouldn't pick sides. I think it would be best for Israel. I think it would be best for that whole region. So I don't believe in getting involved, but it is a real mess, but it's been created by too many outsiders interfering. But this Gaza thing, I mean, attacking and bombing Gaza, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What threat are the Palestinians, to Israel or anybody else? They're living in total poverty. They have an unemployment rate probably about 50%, and sure, there are going to be militants, but you have to understand why they're militant, and what is the reasons. But they have been held more or less in bondage for decades now. So it's a real mess. But I think we should just not be involved, and I think the people there should solve the problems, and eventually Israel won't be able to depend on the United States. This whole idea that Israel wants us, or they're getting ready to bomb a country that might have a bomb someday, I mean, it makes no sense to do that, and yet that's what they're anxious for us to do. But what happens when we go broke? We're broke. Well, what happens when it's acknowledged and we can't even afford to feed ourselves? Well, we're not going to have a military. Our military will come home just like the military went home when the Soviet Union collapsed. So we're not going to be there to take care of Israel. So I think it's a mistake. At that time, then, all the people we have offended around the world, whether it's the Palestinians or whoever, they're going to gang up on us, and it will not be good for Israel, because we'll be incapable of providing the protection that they think we're going to have for them forever.
Here's the front page of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, courtesy of the Newseum. Israel launches an assault on Gaza. Let's go to our next caller. Ron joins us now from West Chesterfield, New Hampshire, Democrats line. Hi, Ron.
Hi. Good morning, Representative Paul. I'm honored to speak with you this morning.
Good morning.
Libby, you look beautiful as always, and thank you, C-SPAN. I have two quick comments, one about the Benghazi killings and one about the taxes. I'll start with Benghazi here just real quick. It seems like the Republicans are just looking for anything or any reason to besmirch this administration. Maybe if the Republican Congress hadn't cut funding for security for our embassies by $30 million in the last 2 years, maybe our people would still be alive over there today. I think if they're looking for someone to blame for that, maybe they should look in the mirror. And as far as the fiscal cliff, there again, I think the Republican Congress brought a lot of this on us as well, just simply by not working with this president. That's, pure, plain and simple. Along with the corruption that there has been, political corruption and corporate corruption that almost brought our economy to its knees. It was just less than a year ago, I think, where they did away with insider trading for our politicians. I mean, come on. Nobody has that, nobody in the real world is able to get insider information on what stocks are going to go up and what stocks are going to go down before they do. Why politicians had that ability, it's just corruption. Lots and lots of corruption, and that's one thing that really needs to be cleared up before we're going to be able to clear much of anything else up.
Let's get a response from the congressman.
Yes. I'm a little bit more bipartisan than you are. I think you're right in blaming the Republicans for all of this problem, but the Democrats aren't exempt. I see us living with one-party system. Which candidate in this last election was the Goldman Sachs candidate? They both get money from Wall Street. They both support the same foreign policy. No, I think the problem we had at Benghazi was that we should have recognized first that we shouldn't have supported the rebels and then get involved. Then we ignored all the warnings. And whether we cut a couple dollars back or not, we never cut anything. We might have cut some increases, that is all. But we should have recognized the danger. We should have had those people out of there. Other countries knew it was dangerous. And for us to have stayed there is foolish. But to blame Republicans or blame the Democrats back and forth, I don't think that's as accurate as saying that whether it's the Federal Reserve policy, whether it's the spending policies, whether it's the welfare system, whether it's the foreign policy, it's very, very bipartisan. See, we've had too much bipartisanship and compromise in Washington because they support the same issues. The only thing they don't support are the people who get to pass out the money. And they do fight over the power and the influence, but policies never change. I think that the rhetoric is different. I think Obama, matter of fact, had a more sensible foreign policy approach in this last election. He sounds like he wouldn't be quite. I mean, Romney wanted to increase the military budget by $2 trillion, and Obama sounded like he would be less likely to start a war with Iran. But the truth is, the policies are exactly the same. So I would be very bipartisan in blaming both sides for this, and also the fiscal cliff is the same problem. There's not one side that spends more money on it. Look at what the conservatives do when the Republicans are in charge, and look at what the liberals do when they're in charge. The spending continues, the deficit keeps going, the Federal Reserve keeps bailing out the rich, the welfare. The Democrats are seen as defending the welfare for the poor, and the Republicans defend the rich. The whole thing is they both defend welfare for the rich, number one. The military-industrial complex, the banking system, and the bailouts. They bailed out the very wealthy and the bankers in this crisis in the last 5 years. But the people lost jobs and they lost their houses. But that is very bipartisan. And I think if we stick on this idea that we can blame the Democrats for all the problems or blame the Republicans for all the problems, we're not going to solve the major crisis that we're involved in.
Congressman Paul, Alex writes on Twitter and asks, do you think the Libertarians will take the place of the Republicans as one of the major parties?
No, I don't, because Republicans and Democrats are in charge, and they're one party, and they have control of the system. We send kids, young people, over to Afghanistan and Iraq, and we're going to teach them how to be good Democrats, have democratic elections. But we don't have real freedom here. If I had not run as a Republican, let's say I ran as a Libertarian, I wouldn't have been in the debates. I wouldn't have been able to get coverage. And you can't get on the ballots because of the system. So it's very, very biased. So I think it's very important that whether it's the Green Party or the Libertarian Party, that they do their very best to express themselves and show how they come up short in how their system works. But under the rules today, it's virtually impossible to compete and become a major problem. The only way we can do it is if you have correct ideas. You should infiltrate both the Democratic and the Republican Party. For instance, Keynesian economics is the prevailing economic theories of the last 60 or 70 years. And Nixon one time made a classic statement. He says, we're all Keynesian now, which means the Democratic Party and the Republican Party believe in Keynesian economics, and they still do. But if we're going to solve our problems economically and foreign policy, eventually those ideas have to infiltrate the Democrat Party as well as the Republican Party. But today, to expect the Libertarian Party to become the major party, unless there's a miracle that will not happen, occurs where all of a sudden they allow us to be competitive in third parties. The only alternative we have now is to try to change people's minds and change people's understanding of economics, and then try to infiltrate the system, so that we can influence both parties.
Let's hear from our next caller. John is in Deerfield Beach, Florida, on a Republican's line. Hi, John.
Hi. Hey, good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Two questions. One would be, if the Benghazi situation was a real demonstration, we saw no signs of, death to America, death to Israel, which seems really strange. One other question is, why doesn't anybody say who said to stand down? And if I may ask you one other question about the fiscal cliff, why does no one ever say raise the payroll tax cap to say $1 million or 250,000? Thank you.
Well, they're good questions. Obviously, I don't have those answers, especially in Benghazi, on why people haven't said this or done this. But I just resort to the fact that we set ourselves up for these problems, mainly because we shouldn't be involved in doing these things. But you're right. The investigation should look at that. Who made the rules and who made these decisions and all. But solving these problems is by raising more taxes and moving up the ladder to put more taxes. Spending is the tax. Not the tax is all secondary. It's the spending. So as soon as the spending occurs, they're either going to have to taxes, which people know and understand, or they're going to borrow the money, which is a tax because somebody else has to pay that and you pay interest on it, or you print the money and your prices go up and the value of the dollar go down and you have financial bubbles and you have crashes. So spending is the problem. This whole idea that you can come up with a solution. A lot of conservatives like the fair tax. Well, my fair tax is no tax, no income tax, but no spending. But as long as you want the government to take care of everybody and think the government can manage our lives and manage the economy and have a safety net for the rich, as well as pretending to take care of the poor, and as long as you believe you can police the world, none of these problems can be solved. You have to cut spending. You can't cut spending unless you have restraint on the government. And it isn't like I'm inventing this and I want you to do something new and strange. All we'd have to do is have people in Washington who would take the oath of office seriously and look at Article 1, Section 8 and say, oh, you mean that's the only thing we're allowed to do? And if it's not prohibited by the Constitution, you mean everything goes back to the states and to the people, like the Amendment 10, 10th Amendment? That would solve the problem. But nobody is interested in that. They're interested in, how am I going to get this? Who am I going to stick? Who's going to be the victim? How are we going to soak the rich? At the same time, all these things that are pretending to soak the rich, they'll get around it, believe me. They'll go offshore. But who suffers? The people who lose their jobs. Right now, we have 47 million people on food stamps. We still have 20-some thousand people who are unemployed, and our government tells us we're coming out of the recession. So those are the kind of things that you have to deal with, and you can't do it by more of the same. More spending, more debt, more borrowing, and more printing of money. Believe me, that's all we're doing, and we're just driving ourselves into a deeper hole.
Congressman Ron Paul represents Texas' 14th district. That includes Galveston, Lake Jackson, Victoria, and Freeport. He's rounding out his 12th term, retiring at the end of this 112th Congress. And of course, he ran for president this past year as part of the campaign 2012 in the Republican field. He was also the Libertarian Party nominee for president back in 1988. His experience includes time as an Air Force flight surgeon, a U.S. House member for a couple of different time periods. He was the Republican nominee for U.S. House back as early as 1974, before you entered office in 1979. Well, we dug into the C-SPAN archives to find some footage of you in the C-SPAN video library, talking about some issues that you're still passionate about to this day. This is from April 20th, 1983. Let's take a look at Congressman Ron Paul.
Following the bombing of our embassy in Lebanon, there have been statements concerning the need to tighten security at all U.S. embassies in order to protect U.S. diplomatic personnel. No one has suggested an obvious alternative for protecting our foreign service personnel stationed abroad. We should withdraw our diplomatic personnel from volatile areas of the world. In suggesting such a withdrawal, I'm not suggesting the breaking of diplomatic relations with these foreign governments. If the closing of our embassies is impossible, we should at least be taking steps to greatly reduce the scope of their functions. In this era of rapid transportation and instantaneous communications, the role of our embassies and of the ambassadors serving abroad has drastically changed. In previous eras, when communications and travel were slow and cumbersome, the U.S. ambassador made binding policy decisions without consultation with Washington. Nowadays, the decision-making process is centralized in Washington. Ambassadors and embassy personnel merely carry out policy decisions that are made at Foggy Bottom. Modern technology has reduced the need for the large embassies. We must also end the practice of stationing intelligence agents in our embassies. This practice helped to precipitate the hostage crisis in Iran and possibly even in Lebanon. These intelligence agents serve no diplomatic function whatsoever.
Well, that's our guest, Congressman Ron Paul, back on April 20th, 1983. We found that in the C-SPAN video library. Congressman Paul.
I'm amazed. I remember that period of time very well. I do not remember that particular speech, but it seems like the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, some of what I was talking about there could apply to, particularly in Libya right now. And I think I said this earlier. Well, why stay there? Why get involved? And but the final, once again, it isn't something that I thought this up. It's just sort of looking at our history and looking at some of the advice. The founders, most people honor the founders as being pretty smart individuals, and they say, stay out of entangling alliances, don't even get involved in internal affairs of other nations, be friends with all nations, practice diplomacy, and have trade with people, and be more tolerant of their problems, like we can't go in and solve them, and that we would have a better worldwide situation, we'd have more prosperity and more peace. But I think it's a great idea, and I think if we'd have taken that advice from the founders, we would have had less problems, certainly throughout the 20th century. Just look at the 20th century, the hundreds of millions of people that died in all the wars that went on. In the 21st century, it looks like we've accepted the notion that we're going to have perpetual war. The global war on terrorism. We have a drone warfare. We declare that whoever's running it, the CIA or the military, that we can drop a bomb, we have kill lists, that Americans can be put on it, and we have drone warfare, and that we can attack anybody, any place, anytime. This is tragic. The American people have to wake up. It isn't the government's going to wake up. The government's going to do what they've been doing. The American people have to wake up and say, this is enough, and that's going to happen when they no longer can pay the bills, when the checks bounce, when Social Security doesn't work, and when people are suffering, our troops come home. Then we better sit down and say, hey, maybe a good starting point is to look at our Constitution.
Let's hear from Johnson City, Tennessee. Devin, Independent Line. Hi, Devin.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Dr. Ron Paul.
Good morning.
And thank you for serving this country. My two questions are, where do you think this country will be in about 10 years from now? And do you plan on running in 2016? And if you do, will you run with Jesse Ventura?
No, I don't have any plans for 2016. You want to know where I think the country's going to be in 10 years? Matter of fact, I'm pretty optimistic that things might be a lot better. But the problem is we have to go through the ringer first. Where I am very encouraged is, I deal with ideas and changing people's attitudes about the role of government and self-reliance and responsibility. But where I have been encouraged, whether it was in the 08 campaign or the 12 campaign, that the reception kept growing and growing on the universities. And all true philosophic revolutions have to engage young people, have to engage the university, the people who want to deal with ideas. And the receptions have been fantastic. And they're interested in free markets, they're interested in this, and they know the young people graduating from college are aware. What do they have? Personal debt that they can't pay. The jobs that they're getting aren't worth all that much, and they know there's a problem. So they're enjoying this idea that there is a solution. And this is what is important. If we change the attitude of a whole generation, in 10 years from now, they may do the rebuilding. And I think that we are going to survive it. Our traditions are great. Our traditions are much greater than they were with the Soviet Union collapsing, going back in the old traditions of Russia. So we're better off. But this is a worldwide phenomenon, and I think a lot of other countries are looking at this. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed and working for the day, and I'll do this outside of politics as I leave Congress. But there's every reason to be optimistic on the long run, but not to be naive and think, let's just get a few more negotiations over here, and we're going to negotiate, and we're going to solve our problem of the fiscal crisis because we're going to trade. That's not going to work.
Marcus on Twitter also asks about your future plans and wants to know if you will work to reform election laws to make ballots more accessible to third parties.
Boy, I have always done that and always will work on trying to reform it. You know what would be a real help is if it were legal to put your name on a ballot. Let's say, obviously people know I have libertarian beliefs, but if I could run on two-party labels, Republicans and Libertarians, and add them up together, this would give more credibility to the third parties. In New York, you could run as a Republican and as a conservative. I think we should have more of that. But it's going to take a lot more than that, because it's going to take changing the laws. And like I said earlier, Republicans and Democrats control state legislatures, and they make it very, very difficult to get on ballots and getting all these signatures. It is easier to get on ballots in some of the countries in the Middle East that we think are chaotic than it is in this country.
Let's hear from Kay in San Diego on our Democrats line. Good morning, Kay.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello, Dr. Paul. I'm so honored to talk to you, and I admire how all these years you've walked to the beat of your own drummer. And I wanted to let you know that my grandson Nathan, who's 15, was inspired by you to get interested in politics, and so he's really coming along and learning a lot. My question is, I hear you speak of it sometimes, but even though I study politics and I'm really interested in it, I've never been able to understand the Federal Reserve Bank and how it works. And I was wondering if you could explain to me the basic workings of it and why it can be a detriment.
Well, the Federal Reserve is a central bank. A central bank controls the money supply, and they interfere in the marketplace. This argument has gone on for a long time. Jefferson and Hamilton argued about this. Hamilton wanted a central bank, and he won, and he had the first U.S. bank. And Jefferson got rid of that. So this has been going on a long time. But our central bank, the Federal Reserve, was started in 1913, and they get tremendous power. They're created by Congress and the government, but they're secret and private in the sense that nobody really controls them. So right now, for instance, the Federal Reserve, in this banking crisis and financial crisis we had in 08 and 09, the Federal Reserve was able to create out of thin air $15 trillion and pass it out around the world to central banks and corporations and foreign governments, and it's all secret. Now, we're getting more exposure, and we work real hard on getting the audit, but it is their power to create money out of thin air, and what they do is they lower interest rate lower than they should be, sends bad information, so it causes financial bubbles. So just putting more money in circulation doesn't cause more prosperity. It causes, say, like prices of houses to go up too high until people discover it, and then there's a crash. So that business cycle and the extremes are caused by the Federal Reserve. So it's one of the biggest issues. But there's a lot of good things on the internet about the central bank, and people should read the writings of Murray Rothbard, who has some very, very good literature written about the central bank. There's one, "What Has the Government Done to Our Money?" is an excellent little pamphlet that he's written. But it's very important, and this is one thing I can tell you: the people on our college campuses, at least the ones that came to our rallies, are very, very much aware of the detriment that the Federal Reserve has been to us.
Congressman Ron Paul represents Texas' 14th district. There's a story from Reuters that says 7 states qualify for secession response from White House. Citizens from more than 40 states have filed petitions with the White House seeking to secede from the Union. And by Wednesday, 7 states had gathered enough signatures to qualify for a response to the largely symbolic protest. This story has prompted a couple of questions from our audience. We've got one from Facebook. Norman wants to know whether you support the secessionist movement, and Paul on Twitter says Texas leads that charge to peacefully leave the U.S. federal government. Is it treason?
Well, I don't call for secession, but I call for the principle of secession being recognized. The founders believed in it. There's no prohibition in the Constitution against secession. They all understood that they were coming together, and if they're voluntarily coming together, they can voluntarily leave anytime they want, and that they were protected with that belief with the 10th Amendment. But now it's people are said that, oh, these people have to be put on a list, that they saying that there should be a right of secession, and they want to put them put them on a list that they're committing treason, put in prison, or thrown out of the country. What about the First Amendment? So no, the principle of secession is very important. Not so much for the purpose of seceding, but the purpose of saying to the federal government, if you mistreat us, that's what we might consider. So I don't think anybody's serious about that happening soon or anything else. But if you just had that principle, that nullification is the same thing. What if the states could nullify the law? Look how wonderful it would have been to solve the problem of Obamacare if the states could just nullify the thing and get out of it. And so nullification and secession should always be there. The New England states in the early part of the 19th century talked about secession. Nobody condemned them for it. Secession is what we did when we left England. We seceded from England. It was a wonderful thing. And nobody complained about the secession of the Eastern Bloc nations seceding and getting out of the communist bloc. So, no, this whole idea, the hysteria in opposition and condemning these people as being un-American because they even talk about secession, because they talk about it doesn't mean that they're leading the charge. I'm sure there are people who would like to do that. But my position is that the principle of secession should always be there. If it had been there, along with nullification, believe me, this federal government would be not the size it is today.
Ottawa, Illinois, Bobby, Republican caller. Welcome, Bobby.
Welcome. Thank you. I want to say thank you to Congressman Paul for opening my eyes this year and educating me. But my primary question is on the inheritance tax, and how do we fight the inheritance tax as people in, states? Because really what it's doing is preventing us from keeping our own family money. And I'd also like him to touch on Agenda 21 or the United Nations and how we get billions to them and how we could use that here.
Well, the inheritance tax is a vicious tax because it's an attack on capital. In a free society, you want capital to be built. So if you're taxing it with capital gains tax or inheritance tax, so you have a small businessman that it gets up to $1 million or $2 or $3 million, and then the family inherits and they have to break it up. That's destruction of capital. It's destruction of savings. So there should be no inheritance tax. The businesses were built with money that they pay taxes on. So that is very destructive, and we should not have an inheritance tax. And this is to me one of the most important taxes that we can change. And you know what is interesting over the years? Often at the beginning I used to wonder, why is it that this seemed like average middle class people coming to me and want to deal with the inheritance tax? I don't have rich people coming. They all have a way of getting around it. They all have trust funds and overseas investments, and they have all kinds of protection. But the average person that has a small business or a farm that they don't want to give up, they're the ones who are going to get hit and destroyed. So once again, the inheritance tax is to go get those rich, but it ends up getting some rather middle-class individuals who are well-to-do enough where they have a business worth something. So those kind of taxes always backfire.
One of our followers on Twitter wants to know what you make of this story. Here's a reporting from the New York Times. Former presidential candidate Mitt Romney attributed Obama's win to gifts. That's the headline, saying that he and his team still felt troubled by the loss to President Obama. Mitt Romney on Wednesday attributed his defeat in part to what he called big policy gifts that the president had bestowed on loyal Democratic constituencies, including youth voters, African Americans, and Hispanics. Gene writes in on Twitter and wants to know what you thought, and Gene says it sounded like his 47% tape. What do you think?
Yeah, it wasn't a very good political statement. There was a grain of truth involved because that's what politicians do. I mean, that's the way they get elected. Republican candidates for president, when they're in office, they go to places where they just given lots of money to an industry. I bailed out you, bailed out you. So that is tradition. But this whole 47% I find very interesting because like I said, there's a grain of truth to that. People are receiving things and they don't want to lose it. Just look at the demonstration in Greece. They're scared to death. They're going to lose their benefits. But what he forgot to say is the big money, the big benefits, the big welfare goes to the corporations, the military-industrial complex. So it's bigger than 47%, and that's why the status quo is maintained. So if you're at Boeing and you're getting fantastic contracts from airplanes, and Romney wanted to spend $2 trillion more in military, I mean, he's promising too. You vote for me, I'm going to buy more weapons. It's the same thing. So it isn't an all or nothing thing. And to say, well, politically, you have to be careful because politics is mostly demagoguing and distortion rather than dealing with the facts. But no, there's way too many in one way or the other receiving from government. But the one thing I've learned after coming to Washington is if you sort of resent this whole idea of welfare redistribution, that that the poor, they're deceived. They believe that if you pass out food stamps, that's where most of the welfare is, but that's minor compared to the food stamps to the rich. And therefore, it's the principle of redistribution of wealth through government edicts. That's what has to be rejected. And the poor say, no, I need my food stamps. But believe me, they're getting hit harder than the rich because General Motors and others, they got the bailouts. The little guy didn't get the bailout.
Our next caller is from Congressman Paul's home state of Texas. John is in Houston on our independent line. Hi, John.
Good morning. Good morning, Congressman Paul.
Good morning.
The first question I have for you today, I have two questions. The first one is on the reform of the process by which government organizations spend their money. So you hear a lot of talk with the lawmakers and stuff talking about cutting the budget, but once they spend a budget, they put a budget in place. You've got people working below that level with that money, and they're kind of restricted in what they can and can't do with it. To use an example, I got a friend of mine who's a commander in the Army, and the military gives him a budget, and he has to spend the amount they give him, or else he can get in big trouble. And of course, if you talk about not wanting to spend the amount he gets this year, then he's not going to have the amount he needs next year. So that's just one example in the military. But by and large, what I've seen is pretty much the same way in other government type organizations. So the second question I had, if you go back to the 60s and the civil rights movement, and talking about Barry Goldwater, one of the reasons, if I recall, that he didn't win the election with his libertarian ideologies was because at the same time they had so many, with the powers going to the states, there were some governors in the South that were doing some kind of crooked things that at this point our country's really grown beyond. But what's the potential civil impact of reducing the size of government and the spending when the country's depending on the government to fulfill a specific role, the federal government?
Okay.
Well, if you reduce it, then the people spend the money, and they'll spend it productively. When governments spend the money, they always spend it politically, and that's what happens in the military. You point about, the waste and the things that are being spent in the military, and I'm all for getting rid of waste and fraud and abuse, but that's not the solution. Once you give money to a politician or a bureaucrat, they always are wasteful and fraudulent and abusive. If you look at the military budget, everybody's yelling and screaming about $50 billion of proposed cuts and a cut in the proposed increases in the military. And I understand there's a lot more money than that in the military budget. It has nothing to do with the military. So if you just got rid of all that, you would solve a lot of the problems. So it's the nature of government. So whether it's domestic or whether it's on the military, we should do our very best because we have to have a national defense to be more efficient. But it's sort of a culture. And I'm very much aware, having been in the military, on how people are told, well, you're going to get the budget. If you don't use up this budget, that means you're going to be cut for the next year. So they work very hard to make sure they spend every penny. It's exactly opposite of what a businessman does. So that is why a businessman is rewarded by not spending the money. He has money in the bank to invest. So this is exactly opposite. They're encouraged to do the wrong thing, and that's why there's so much more benefit from a business decision. Individuals, whether it's the average saver, the average worker, or whether it's an investor, they're not capable of avoiding mistakes. They're going to, but they only involve themselves. But when government makes a mistake, it involves all of us, and that's where the problem is.
Derek, Washington, D.C., Democrats line, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to say that for Congressman Ron Paul, that if you can remember that when...
Please turn on your TV, Derek. We're listening to you. Keep going.
Okay, if you can remember when Mitch McConnell was asked what would be the Republicans' top agenda, and he responded by saying it would be to make President Obama a one-term president. Now, since then, I've noticed a lot of times how the Republicans would vote against a lot of the policies and ideas that he had that would have helped this country get ahead, at least most of them. And they voted against it. Are they still going to do that on this term because they didn't make him a one-term president?
Well, that's the way politics work. I remember when George Bush Sr. had his first and only term, was the whole purpose of the Democrat Party was to make him a one-term president. Yeah, that's the way it works. And even though the policies aren't different, that power struggle is very real. So if they can embarrass the other party, but the only thing I argue for is to be more objective and say, yeah, that is true. The Republicans do that, and they get off on tangents and they get on this partisan bickering. But it is bipartisan, believe me. It's not like the Democrats are angels and the Republicans are the monsters. I think that they share, both parties share the same amount of blame.
Are you going to miss serving in Congress? You're in your last few weeks here, and adding on to that, Sea of Tranquility tweets in and asks what advice you would give to the new members. How would you improve Congress?
Well, you know, I've been in and out of Congress for a good while, for 23 years, I think, total. And I only have 2 weeks left to solve the problems. And I kept saying, like I said in my speech yesterday, you know, I've been here and I didn't solve very many problems.
This is your farewell speech on the House floor.
My advice to people is really deal more in ideas and deal with people and deal with understanding economics and learning how to take care of ourselves and what self-reliance is, and read the Constitution, obey the Constitution. But I think that's where we're seeing some real progress. I think there's going to there are some newer people coming into the Congress, and I think they're going to do a good job. There was a time when one or two of us would be saying things like this. I think there's going to be a couple dozen. And if people are speaking out on principle, I think that it'll be very beneficial. So I think things are going to move in the right direction. But like I said, I think we're going to go through some serious problems first.
Let's hear from Howie in Philadelphia, Republican caller. Go ahead, Howie.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'm going to try to be real quick. I'm running a little late. Congressman Dr. Ron Paul, a veteran, thank you for your service for the common people. I have a couple quick questions. Have you recognized Justin Amash legislative bill? It's kind of an anti-National Defense Authorization Act, and I was wondering if maybe we should apply the pressure somehow. You know, it's hard for me to speak. I'm a little nervous because I thank you for everything, but I was wondering if maybe you thought about applying the pressure to everybody that works in government. Like, how about some kind of an anti-subsidy law or an anti-lying law? And last point, and how about drug testing these people that work for government, like every 48 hours, and that includes coffee, sugar, everything? Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, I think that would be a little extreme. I don't know the particular law you're talking about. I know Justin Amash is a very good member of Congress and very, very determined to follow the Constitution, so I'm sure he's on the right track. But drug testing, I think we're overdoing this. We should never have general drug testing. I think that there has to be reasonable cause and a justification. But it could be handled in the private sector rather easily. The businessman has a right, if he's running an airline, he has a right to test people who are flying his airplanes. And that should be done. But for government to come in and say that we're going to drug test anybody and everybody, and even federal officials, if they don't have a vital function, I don't believe in generalized drug testing for everybody that works for the federal government unless they're in a position where they could endanger others. So I don't think that would solve many of our problems. Matter of fact, I've been pretty strong on record about emphasizing how bad this drug war has been and the carelessness, how we violate civil liberties when it comes to enforcing these drug laws.
What do you think about the ballot initiatives that passed in Colorado and Washington state to legalize recreational use of marijuana? Does that signify a change?
I think that's very good, and that's where it should be done. It should be done at the state. The state should, prohibition of alcohol nationally was a total disaster. Al Capone did quite well with it, and the drug dealers are doing quite well today. But alcohol is now legal, but it's regulated. Children aren't allowed to buy alcohol, and they can get marijuana easier than they can get alcohol because of the ridiculousness of our laws. But I just signed a letter with Barney Frank, sending it to the president, saying, bug off. Don't go into these two states. They've just legalized this. That's their right. And besides, somebody that, the president's been enforcing these drug laws against patients in California who under the state law, they were allowed to use it for health reasons. People with multiple sclerosis and who are in wheelchairs, and they want to arrest people like this. So Barney Frank and I wrote a letter and said, look, the states have acted. There is such a thing as the 10th Amendment. They have a right to do this, and I think it's going to happen. More and more people are waking up on how silly this drug war is. The silliness of this drug war is that because hemp looks a little bit like marijuana, that we've made it illegal, even though you can't smoke hemp, and the whole thing is totally out of control. But these two votes, I think, are very, very important. Hopefully the president will take advice from us. This is a coalition of left and right coming together, and Libertarian, and saying to the president, don't crack down on the states. They have a right to do what they're doing with marijuana.
Congressman Ron Paul, representing Texas' 14th District as a Republican. He's finishing up his 12th term. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Coming up next, independent Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders joins us, and later on we'll look at the health insurance exchanges states are setting up. First, this news update from C-SPAN Radio.
It's 8:46 a.m. Eastern Time. Unemployment figures in this hour. Evidently, Superstorm Sandy drove the number of people seeking the benefits up to a seasonally adjusted 439,000 last week. That's the highest level in 18 months. The Labor Department says applications increased by 78,000 because a large number of applicants filed in states damaged by the storm. People can claim unemployment benefits if their workplaces close and they don't get paid. An update on the Deepwater Horizon explosion in the Gulf of Mexico. BBC says that BP is set to receive a record fine of between $3 and $5 billion to settle criminal charges related to the 2010 accident. BBC business editor Robert Peston says it'll be the biggest criminal penalty in U.S. history. The settlement will be with the U.S. Justice Department, involves BP pleading guilty to criminal charges. In addition, there's word that up to 4 BP staff will be arrested. 2 will be charged with manslaughter. The 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster killed 11 workers and released millions of barrels of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico over 87 days. And more on David Petraeus from Defense Secretary Leon Panetta. In remarks earlier in Thailand, he says he still has confidence in General John Allen. He's the general commanding forces in Afghanistan, even though he's been drawn into the scandal surrounding former CIA Director Petraeus. He went on to say that he knows of no one else implicated in the scandal. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff also expressing support for General John Allen. Meanwhile, the Senate Armed Services Committee meets this morning on the nomination of General Joseph Dunford to replace outgoing General Allen. You can hear that live on C-SPAN Radio at 10 a.m. Eastern Time or watch it on C-SPAN 3. And those are some of the latest headlines on C-SPAN Radio.
For the last